Yeah, forward it to me. All right. It seems as if we are live. Welcome to our sermon talkback today, and hello to all of our friends who are joining us online. We love you. If you have a question, please email talkback@myersparkbaptist.org. Talkback@myersparkbaptist.org. We want to make sure that we can weave your questions into the conversation as well. If you are in person and you have a card, just wave it and somebody will come get it from you. And we'll incorporate that into the conversation. Dr. Boswell, another great sermon.
Thank you, Mia.
Now, yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Pastor-elect,
Oh, please,
Reverend Mia McLean. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you
Yeah,
very much. Yes.
Enough.
Pastor to pastor. See, it's pastor to pastor now.
Oh, gosh. We will continue our banter throughout the years.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit more about this NASA, this revelation that we had this week, and how, I wouldn't have even thought to kind of weave that into Acts 17. That wouldn't have crossed my mind. So tell me about that process for you coming from that news story into the text that you had already chosen weeks ago.
The text has been chosen for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then this constellation of pictures came in the middle of the week, and it was just kind of a gift. So on Wednesday, I was preparing for weekly meditation, which I know we have some folks here who join me weekly for that. And I was trying to think, what should we meditate on this week? And I was struck by the pictures that came out Wednesday also at the same time, and from the Webb telescope, and I thought, why don't we spend some time in meditation on these images as our meditation for the silent meditation work that we do each week. And so I put a quick PowerPoint together and brought them to our group, and we viewed them while we meditated for 20 minutes together on Wednesday morning, and it was very powerful. And what I felt happening to me was a transcendent sort of experience where all of the news of the summer, let's just say the whole summer, but particularly right now, began to be transcended by this glimpse into, I see it as a glimpse into God and God's self, but a glimpse into the creation that God has and how vast, 13 billion years old, and how small a blip we are as humanity, let alone my tiny little solitary life in the midst of the 6 billion years that humans have been here, let alone 6 million years that humans have been here, let alone the relationship to the 13 billion years. And so now what the telescope is doing is literally giving us the ability to time travel back 13 billion years into the past to see what it looked like when creation began, only 6 billion years after the Big Bang, and to look at those images and to get some perception of ourselves in relationship to how big God's creation is. And it's really humbling, and it puts a lot of things in perspective, and it helps you take a longer view and of history, of the world. It also helped me think differently about God and what God may be in God's self and the vastness of God, the mystery of God. And I saw in Paul's words to the Athenians an attempt by Paul to try to connect with them through an experience or a description of God's vastness, how God is not an idol, right? Instead, God is the creator of all things, the creator of the universe, not made by human hands, but the one who created all the boundaries and all the nations and all the waters and everything. And there's a connection instead of connecting by saying, look at what we have in common, which is kind of what he's doing, he's really saying, look at what God transcends. God transcends everything and all nations. And so that was sort of the starting point for me, was my own spiritual meditation on the images themselves and what they revealed to us, as well as just how Paul frames God as creator in the text.
There's nothing that makes me feel small like seeing pictures like that. or standing in front of the ocean, either one, right? There's just something about the vastness of creation, even on this planet, that we do not understand, that we cannot tap into. And so the idea that we can try to capture God in a piece of architecture or an altar, something that we've built, is really silly, for us to even try to think that we have captured God in this building or in an artifact.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So we have a question here. How is hate converted to empathy? How could irritation initiate the other?
How is hate converted to empathy? And then say the second part again.
How could irritation initiate the other?
Yeah, I think if we take a cue from Paul's experience in Athens, we can see his distress, his irritation, his provocation over all the idols. And I think, to give you a relationship to present day, when we hear about idolatry in the Bible, most of the time when I was growing up in the evangelical tradition, it was always about other religions. That is not what Paul is dealing with here. Paul is dealing with the gods of a pantheon of the state, which help uphold state power. So it would be more like walking through Athens with Paul would be kind of like going to First Baptist Dallas on July 4th. That's what Paul felt in Athens. He felt.
Can you say more about that, just in case somebody doesn't?
First Baptist Church Dallas is run by Pastor Jeffries, who is very, very close friends with our former president. And every 4th of July, they unveil a flag that is bigger than the backdrop of their whole sanctuary, covering everything. And everybody brings flags in, and it's all this patriotism and celebration of military and celebration of America. It's the worship of America. They're not worshiping God, they're worshiping America on the 4th of July. And it's disgusting. And that's what Paul felt when he was in Athens, because all the gods of the Athenians were not just like, we think of it as like Zeus and Hermes and all these beautiful kind of mythology. No, they were all tied to the power of the state. And so it's not a coincidence that Paul preached on Mars Hill. Who was Mars? Does anybody know? God of war, right? Paul is taking up a particular position in relationship to the God of war. Now, it's so ironic to me to see churches that promote war called Mars Hill.
Right.
How ironic.
Wasn't that big megachurch pastor?
That megachurch pastor and the whole podcast about him. It's very ironic to see churches named Mars Hill today that are for war, when Paul was standing on Mars Hill preaching against war, talking about the solidarity of humanity and how we're all created by the same creator and how we need to stand against the state gods that would promote violence, the Greek gods of violence and power. So I see it very ironic today. It just shows how wildly we've misinterpreted Scripture. And because we worship America alongside God to the point where it becomes the worship of America and God is nowhere to be found. And that's what Paul's experience is as he's going around. And by the way, Jewish people like himself, scholars like himself, would have been trained to distaste that, because their particular kind of monotheism did not imagine that God could ever be contained within an idol. Therefore, God could never be contained in a sanctuary. God could never be contained in a statue. So all the statues that were to these state gods would have been seen to him like a statue of Robert E. Lee. Or you could say George Washington, doesn't matter. To him, they would have been trash to him. Disgusting, ridiculous. And so instead, he transcends these sort of human-created idols of war and violence and state power by saying an appeal to the creator of the universe. No, this is the creator that created all of us, all nations. You call it the unknown God. This God wants to be known by you. And there's a transcendence of these national and state gods there that's happening. So anyway, I think let me start there by saying that's where the irritation to the question, Paul's irritation provokes him into debate. He will not allow these idols to stand unchallenged. Like Abraham before him, he is there to smash idols. Like Jesus, he's come to smash the idols, right? it is the twilight for idols. And that's Paul, that's Jesus, that's Abraham, that's Nietzsche, whoever it is. They've come to smash the idols. And at the same time, then there's this pivot, which is very interesting. This is really the first part of that question, which is how does Paul then go from really being disgusted and detesting the Athenians for their basic jingoistic faith in state power and empire religion, and then turn that toward openness and an invitation, instead of just bringing it all, the hammer down. Now, it may be because he's standing before them all by himself. There's no Silas, there's no Timothy. He could easily die. They could kill him and nobody would even know he's dead until they got to Corinth and didn't see him there. I mean, he's very vulnerable in this story. But in his vulnerability, he turns an open hand toward the Athenians and says, okay, let's try to transcend all this together. You know, you think of me as Jewish, promoting this foreign divinity called resurrection, called Jesus, and you're accusing me of that. You're accusing me of bringing new things. I know what happens when you accuse people. Paul knew the story of Socrates 400 years ago, probably a very important story at that time for Paul. He knew what could happen to him, and so he turns and pivots and says, no, let's transcend all this down here, and let's go up here, and let's talk about the fact that we're all created in the image of God. We're all God's children, as your own poets say. We're all living in God, in whom we live and move and have our being, as your own philosophers say. And this God created all the nations, not just Greece, not just Rome, but all the nations, right? And wants us all to search for God and know God and learn God and come into connection and relationship with God. So I don't know how it happened, but I tried to give the Spirit credit. I think something's happening in Paul as he's standing before the council where the Spirit gets a hold of him. And he says, okay, let me try a new strategy, because we don't see this strategy used very often by Paul in the book of Acts. It's a particular strategy. So I don't know what it is that turns hate toward empathy. What I'm hoping is that there is something divine about that, some kind of spiritual power that gives us the ability in certain moments to see that a turn toward hate or standing in our hate is not going to change the other person. And we do need to have boundaries. I did talk about that in the sermon. There's got to be accountability. There has to be boundaries. There has to be responsibility for the other. And we can also open a hand of invitation. And so how we do that, I think, is up to each person to discover.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm still working on the empathy part.
Aren't we all?
I don't think I'm pivoting from hate, but I think I'm pivoting not from a lack of empathy. I don't.
No,
yeah. I don't think I'm at hate, but I think that there are people on the other side who are
they're at hate. Yeah.
Kind of sitting that our way.
Sure. Well, and the Athenians, they sort of pivot too. They don't kill him. That's kind of a pivot for them. They don't execute him. They don't force him to drink hemlock. I mean, that's a pivot for the Athenians. Like I was trying to claim, they're not the bastion of open-mindedness that we get in our history books and our world civilization classes. They had slaves, right? The first democracy in the world had slaves, and they were very intolerant religiously. Very, very intolerant. You know, look at the story of Socrates. That's why I tried to use that example, because Paul's conjuring Socrates. Luke's conjuring Socrates in the telling of the story of Paul. He's conjuring the image of Socrates before the Areopagus, defending himself, defending his challenging of the status quo, defending his challenging of state deities, which Socrates did. Anyway, I think we need to see that image there and hold that in contrast. There's these boundaries. As I try to say, there's sort of the asabia and the agape. There's the protest and the love. There's a hand that's saying no to idolatry and an open hand saying, yes, we want you in our community. God wants you. We want you as a part of the work that the creator of the universe is doing. How do you do both of those at the same time, the hand up and the hand open?
Speaking of sort of the both, this question says, how do we grieve the lives of racists and gunmen without doing injustice to their victims? So I'm sensing there's a desire to have some sort of empathy or acknowledgement of the loss of life and the loss of way of these people who have harmed others or killed others. Can we do both? Is that possible?
Well, I think we can, but we have to be intentional. One of the things I've heard people say before when we've named the names, and we can't do this every week anymore because there's too many names, but name the names of the victims is, why didn't you name the shooter? And the problem with naming the shooter is, first of all, it could be too soon for the victims. That's the first thing. But also, most of these shooters, as I've preached about before, are looking for glory. The goal is glory. So when you name them, you contribute to the glorification. Part of it is like leaving their name behind them in this way that we will always know their name, like we know the name of the person who killed, Lincoln and Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. We know those names. And in fact, isn't it weird that we always get their whole names, all three names? So we know all three names. The same is true of these shooters. And I don't know if I want to participate in that. I think that's almost like a valorization that's starting to happen early on, and a giving of glory too quickly to the shooter. I want to refrain from that for a little while. So I might say, if I was going to do it with intention, I might say all the names of the victims and then say, and the shooter. Or something like that. Not name them. But I do think there is wisdom in this question, because there's something I saw in the testimony of those two men, and I'm taking it very authentically. It may have been totally disingenuous. I don't know yet. But I'm taking what occurred this week at the January 6th hearings very authentically. Two white men who participated got up and told the truth. This was probably not easy for them to do. If you think it was easy, have you ever been before Congress before on live television? I mean, I haven't. I think it would be very hard. I think it was very challenging. One of them even mentioned how their life now has been destroyed. I see some of that as accountability, but other parts of it I see as, look at what their attachment to that ideology cost them. And I think this is what we have to remember, that people who are trapped in the ideology of whiteness or trapped in the ideology of oppression, whatever form it may be, are also hurting. They might not feel like they're hurting because they're benefiting. They think they look like they're benefiting from the hatred and the violence and the glorification and the power that seems to come from violence and the power that seems to come from oppression, but they're actually hurting inside. And it's appropriate to feel sorry for them. It's appropriate to feel, wow, how sad for you to have to choose that idolatry, that ideology, and live in that space. So it's sort of like, I've talked about this before, there's a great book called Dying of Whiteness that talks about how people in the Midwest, particularly, but everywhere in the country this is happening, are literally voting in ways that are contributing to their own death. They're voting against their own health care. They're voting for gun proliferation, which is leading to the death of more white men than anyone else in this country. More white men die from guns than anybody else. And there's another one too, I can't remember right now off the top of my head, but this is a really important book by Jonathan Metzl, who's a sociologist. What he's saying in arguing the book is that our addiction as white people to the power that comes from whiteness is actually a suicidal addiction. It kills us. And it starts with killing poor white people first.
I was going to say something about the class, and I don't know
dynamic.
The two men, I didn't watch it, so I don't know the two men that you're referring to in the hearings, but my assumption is, like many of the people who trekked their way to D.C.
Right.
on that day, they are not people who are of significant means.
Yeah.
Right? This is not, the wealthy were
Well, some
not.
were. Some were and some weren't.
But
Yeah.
there was a huge portion of them who were
Right.
kind of caravanning, and this was,
Yep.
so they, the ideology put forth by empire from people at the top who have money and means and protection and privilege trickle down to people who do not have those same privileges and protection regardless of their skin color and their race, right?
This is so important because we have to remember this as we're trying to get involved in these battles. Everybody's like, Ben, well, you care so much about whiteness. Why don't you go leave our church probably and then go down to Union County and spend your work among the white poor and working with Ku Klux Klan members and white nationalists down there. And they think that that's what's going to solve the problem. But in fact, people need to do that. Will Campbell did that. I think there's work there to be done. That's not necessarily my calling, but other people are called to that. I'm not sure that's who needs to be converted. See, the poor white folks and rural folks are pawns in a scheme. It's the elite who benefit from ideology. They're the same, but ideology. Poor people don't benefit from ideology. There's nothing that helps poor people by becoming white nationalists. That does not help them at all. It's not going to give them one more dollar in their pocket. It's not going to give them a better job in their town. It's not going to get them a better house. There's no houses. There's no houses. There's no jobs. We have deindustrialized every rural community in the Appalachian Valley. We have deindustrialized every rural community in America. I lived in two, Bethlehem, where Bethlehem Steel was, which they shipped overseas, Kannapolis, where Fieldcrest Cannon was, and people could live and get a job at the mill and take care of their family and send their kids to college. Can't do that anymore. Those places are gone. And so there's a deep level of resentment, right? And those folks, they don't know where to turn that resentment towards. I don't blame them for that, but they've got a lot of resentment. So where are they going to turn it? Well, what are they watching? Who are they talking to? Who are they listening to? A lot of Fox News. Doesn't matter if it's CNN. The resentment is going to be directed toward the scapegoats of American culture. And so the ideology always benefits the elite, the wealthy, those in power. It benefits the Elon Musks of the world and the Jeff Bezos of the world and the Koch brothers of the world. It doesn't benefit poor people. It's hurting them. And if we could help them come to realize that, if they could come to realize that they have more in common with a poor black American than they do with a white rich American, if that ever happened, this whole country would totally transform. Every time it does happen, the country transforms.
Because it happened in the 60s.
It has happened.
And one of our members wrote about this, right? Didn't Ed do some work down in Mississippi around this, around
oh, yes.
the organizers in the 60s, how they were able to make things happen because they got people of the same class together across race lines to organize.
Right, and it happened after the Civil War, during Reconstruction for a time. And every time it happens, there is a massive amount of white backlash. It happened recently with the George Floyd protests. It happened in the 60s. It happened during Reconstruction. It's happened many times. But every time it happens, the resistance comes. And we think of white backlash as like all white Americans somehow just decided they're against it. But it's usually a propaganda effort by white elites in power and wealth who decide to send out hate literature, hate propaganda that turns the minds of people toward violence toward each other and divides people. So I like to I like to say and joke that whiteness is the original wedge issue, right? That divides the poor from each other. Because whiteness was born to protect white landowning men and their property when they didn't have a government or a police force to protect it. And they didn't have enough guns to protect it like they do now. So what did they do? How do you protect your land and your power when you have no government or police force that you own? Well, you use ideology. So whiteness is the greatest wedge issue because you're able to divide the poor from themselves using whiteness. And you just tell the poor white guy, as you know, Lyndon Johnson said this, other people said this, you got just a little more. You get just a little bit more. You get $1 worth of skin color. Not $100, $1 worth of skin color. You get to be just a little bit better. And that just little bit better is enough to endear them to those who are this much away from them, the white landowning men, instead of their solidarity, right, with poor, enslaved, or oppressed Africans or other people of color in this country. Chinese immigrants, we could go on and on and on here. And then what happens also when there's like a labor issue? Well, we say, oh, the Chinese are coming in to steal your jobs. Well, that's a tool that's used by elite capital, right, to protect their labor force and to protect their products. So all of these ideologies always only benefit elite people with lots of money. They don't benefit the poor. And so I don't know how we get to that point where we help people see that, but I do think we're dealing with a high level of propaganda and ideology. You know, I was thinking about this, after the Holocaust in Germany, folks were so, the Germans, had to figure out, what do we do with our society now that we have participated in the mass extinction and murder and genocide of 8 million people, 6 million Jews. What does it mean to be German anymore? What are we going to do? Well, they engaged in a process called denazification. Literally, it was called denazification. And they went around and they created like small denazification groups in every small town all across Germany, and they went through a very careful psychological, spiritual, emotional process of trying to denazify everybody in their society who had become captivated by the ideology of German National Socialism, you know? We never did anything like that here. We've never done anything like that here. In fact, what we did here after the Civil War is baptize the Confederacy. And now we have the Confederacy reemerging again. It's no surprise. We've never decided to de-Confederize America, or you might say de-whiten America, denazify America from its slaveholding past.
We do performative things, though.
Oh, yeah.
So the removing of statues and
Right.
the painting of Black Lives Matter on the street, the sort of performative gestures, but not the actual deep spiritual work, because I think it is a spiritual process that is required for transformation.
Right. Yeah, I think those things are important. I think the statues should come down. They should have never gone up in the first place, right? We don't need streets named after Confederate generals. There's a book called The End of the Myth. It's about the border. It's a really great history book by Greg Grandin. And he talks about in there, it's the first time I'd ever read anybody kind of laying out how it happened, but that after the Civil War was over, America was not done expanding. Quickly after the Civil War, America began starting to move westward. And it wasn't until after the Civil War that most of Americans' wars against the indigenous happened. There were some before, but it was after the Civil War that most of the indigenous genocide and colonialist actions happened as we moved past the Mississippi, out west. Who fought those wars? Former Confederate generals who had been rebaptized into the army with their original rank. Think about that for a second. You fought against the country. You were basically a treasonous soldier. And then after the Civil War, we gave you your rank back, put you on a horse, and sent you out to fight the indigenous. I mean, they're already racist. It was perfect. They're already racist. So send them out west to go kill indigenous folks. That part, that's way worse than statues, right? Which we put up much later. What that is a redeeming, which is the word they used, a redemption of the Confederacy. And so that Confederate spirit gets redeemed in American life. Only then do we have movies like Gone with the Wind. Only then do we have The Birth of a Nation, the movie that was played in the White House. Only then do we have this return toward the Confederate ideology for all of America, not just for the South. And so I think we forget that we did that. And now then we see the Supreme Court turn Confederate again, and we're like, oh, where'd this come from? No, we've always had that spirit. We've never decided to get rid of it as a part of our national identity. And so we're going to be always haunted by the ghosts of the Confederacy until we finally bury them and put them to rest forever. And so it's challenging to think through that, but I think that's why we see these resurgence again of white nationalists today. It's hard to look at them and say, you don't represent what America really is about, because they do. They do represent what America is about. Yeah. So we have to cast a vision of a new America for them and for all people, because they are, in fact, in more keeping with what we have been than what we are and where we're going. So how do we shift that narrative around that and try to cast a vision of a new America that's a multiracial democracy for all people, to folks that have already decided that they don't want half the country to be here?
Wow. Woo! All right.
That's probably too much.
No, you're fine. I would love to open it for questions. We have some time for a few. You can.
Uh-oh, Devin's got one.
Oh, gee, come on, just come on up to the mic. You just. Or if you want me to read it, I will, but if you just want to go ahead and...
It's just a quick question. I just wondered if you could talk more about the welcoming in that you talked about in the sermon, but specifically how you welcome in people who don't see us as equals or might not even see us as human beings.
Well, I don't know that we can if there's not some ground for common humanity to start. You know, Baldwin says, yeah, we can talk and we can disagree and still love each other as long as your disagreement isn't rooted in my not being human. If our disagreement is rooted in you thinking I'm not human, then we have nowhere to start. And that's where I think Paul's going. I mean, he's really appealing to the cosmos, but it's also a common sense of anthropology. We're all made in the image of God. We're all beloved children of God. We're all human. So, you know, common humanity unites us, and if we can agree, you know, regardless if you're, you know, black or white human, you're still human. That's where the problem comes, though, of course, for, you know, white Christian nationalists who don't imagine that people of color are human in the same way that white people are human. How do you start a conversation if there's no common humanity? I'm not sure you can. I think that's kind of like what I was trying to say about Paul speaking to the mob. Paul doesn't stay around in Thessalonica and Berea to preach to the mob. Paul wouldn't have gone to the Capitol on January 6th and stood on the steps and tried to appeal to their common humanity. Paul's getting out of there. You know, Paul's going to get out of there. And so if there's not some basic understanding of, yes, I believe you're human, and you're just as human as I am, regardless of whether we agree or disagree, then there's nowhere to start. And I would just not even waste your time. Don't even waste your time.
And I love what you say sometimes about open to all people, but not all behaviors.
That's right.
Like we welcome all, and also there are some behaviors that can cross a line. And how do you talked about boundaries in the sermon, and how do we say this is the boundary? And so the disrespecting of my humanity is a boundary, whether it's queer identity or racial, ethnic identity.
Right.
Yeah.
Ability,
yeah.
This is a big one, you know. If you don't understand me as human, treat me as human, talk to me as human, if your organization is not set up to enfold me as human.
Oh, God, there was a great article recently about
that.
this, about disability and how the church is not really welcoming.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ways. We got a lot of ways to go on all these topics. Let's just say that as a church. We're on the way. Let's say we're not, it's not like we're not on the way. We're on the way when we got a long way to go. But how we enfold people and welcome them into our community is a statement of an affirmation of humanity, right? And it's a rehumanizing of those that the world has dehumanized. So this is the argument for why the sign needs to say Black Lives Matter and not All Lives Matter. All lives in America have not been dehumanized. My life in America has not been dehumanized as a white, cis, het man with educational privilege, right, and power. I am not being dehumanized by this country. I am being affirmed even when I shouldn't be. I am being emboldened even when I shouldn't be, right? So that's why you don't say all lives matter, because all lives have not been dehumanized. You say Black lives matter. You say Latinx lives matter. You say trans lives matter. Who are the lives that the society is trying to destroy, right? Nobody's making laws to try to keep me from having a medical procedure, right? Nobody's making laws that would make it impossible for me to go to school somewhere. Nobody's making laws that would make it impossible for people to learn my history. I mean, nobody's making laws that attack me. So therefore, I'm not being dehumanized by our culture and our society. That's why I have to think through what it means to be involved in efforts of rehumanization and be very specific. I think Christ was specific about who needs to be rehumanized. He went to the poor. He went to the sick. You know, he went to the Samaritan. He sought out people who were being marginalized and oppressed by society that he was in, and tried to engage in a rehumanizing effort and a building of a beloved community where everybody was on equal footing. And so I think that's really, really important for us to be thinking about as we look at all these issues that we're on the road on: disability, LGBTQ, race, immigrant injustice, creation, environmental justice, all of it.
In brief, my question would be, how do we disturb ourselves? And then also, how do we disturb a system of violence without being claimed as violent in that, and kind of elaborating. So like the word for disturb, I just had it on my phone here. It's like anastatosantes. Is it similar to the word anastao, which is to resurrection? Is there a bit of the resurrection power of Jesus that is supposed to disturb us? And those words related? And you kind of talked about that last week of how we focus so much on the resurrection now, especially as white people, as, oh, look, we've overcome and we don't have to worry anymore. We can sit down on Sunday and not think about suffering. And so that's part of that question. And then just seeing, I'm glad you talked about how it's these elite parts of the empire that are using their proxies and saying, oh, look how they've caused a riot. But it was actually them who caused the riot, them who started the violence. But then they claim that, that black protesters are causing violence when they're sending their armies to shoot them.
Yeah, that's right.
Or claiming that peace treaties are violent. Or people barricading themselves in a room is violent. So it's a system of laws and structure that licenses violence. How do we disturb that? How do we upturn it? And how do we even disturb ourselves? I will say in my background, we were not conscientious of triggering people. We considered, oh, it was the strong. Oh, you're strong, you can handle it. So how do we even enter into disturbing ourselves, showing people the grief of something without triggering? Where's that space of, hey, we want you to be disturbed, we want you to be roused, we want you to grieve, we want you to feel anger, and the things that you're confronting whiteness, like despair is good. You're confronted. So I know I speak a bit.
No, let me start to try to unpack some of that.
Question and,
it's good. It's
how
really
do we disturb ourselves.
I think we need to start by reframing violence a little bit. The first thing we need to start by reframing violence is to remember what Coretta Scott King said about violence, which is that starving school children is violence. Not giving children access to education is violence. And so not having adequate housing in a city is violence. There are many different forms of violence that are different than just like somebody punching somebody else or taking a stick or breaking up property. There are forms of violence that are all around us all the time. People are always responding to violence. You could make an argument, for instance, that deindustrializing a West Virginian town is a form of violence against the people who welcomed those capitalists in first, hoping that would benefit their communities, and then got bamboozled and were destroyed. Their bodies were destroyed by the hard labor. They were not paid fair wages, and then they just left once they exploited all the resources. It's extractive capitalism. And they destroyed communities all up and down the Appalachian region. You could call that violence. And so you could say that white, poor, rural folks in America are simply responding to the violence that has been perpetrated on them by white elites. Now, they have scapegoated the immigrants and scapegoated African American people and scapegoated liberals because that's what they're being taught. That's the propaganda that they're receiving. So you could say that's violence too. It is violence. There's forms of capitalism that are violence, right? So we have to reframe violence. That's the first thing. If you don't reframe violence, then it's always who threw the first rock, who threw the last rock, right? And who punched who, and who, that's not just violence. That's not the only kind of violence, right? So let's expand our understanding of violence. Taking away health care from women in this country, violence. That's violence. That's going to lead to death. People are going to die because of what the Supreme Court did. That's violence. So we have to reframe violence, expanding our view of what violence is. Secondly, we have to think of violence always as weakness. Violence is weakness, not strength. Violence is the opposite of strength. That's not what our culture tells us. You turn on the TV and it's some Rambo figure with a gun blowing up some community, Turn on the video games. Even the good shows are somebody with a gun, somebody who's powerful. Look at like all the superhero stuff, you know? It's somebody powerful, right? Violence is power. No, violence is weakness. Violence is the lack of an imagination and the inability to process your emotions in a way where you can stand in strength and not lash out with your body. That is what violence is. And you have to reframe it as weakness. When a husband beats their wife, that is the weakest man you'll meet. They are very weak, right? When a country turns to violence, when people attack a capital, that's weakness. I just saw tons of weakness. Weak, pathetic, desperate white folk running up on the Capitol. Weak, right? Violence is the last desperation of a person who is so weak they have no other option. It's because they're not doing the things that they need to do to take care of themselves, right? Going to the therapist, doing the internal investigation, seeking critical thinking, turning off the television for a little while, getting their news from different sources, accountability for their own life, their own emotions, their own anger, their own frustration, their own resentment. Take accountability for it. Don't lash out and project it on others. It's just basic human psychology, right? Counselors would tell you this. Violence is the desperation of the weak. And so we have to reframe violence as weakness. And then we have to frame nonviolent direct action, not pacifism, nonviolent direct action of standing up to power, standing up to oppression, and standing up to violence when it may cost you something as the highest form of strength. Whether that be an individual person standing up against an abuser in their home or in their family, or standing up against violence in a community or in a city, or standing up against violence nationally. We need to see that and praise that as the highest form of strength. We sometimes do this, but then we fail. Like if you think about the way we look at Dr. Martin Luther King, right? Nonviolence was not just theological and philosophical, it was a strategy to change the minds and the conscience of America by forcing those who were already violent to be violent in the open. That's what Selma was about. That's what the bridge is about. That's what Birmingham's about. Get them to be violent to us in the open, to expose the violence that they're doing to us behind the scenes with not letting us vote and not letting us go into grocery stores. Make their violence come to light. Not, and see, everybody accused King of being violent, right? That was a way of trying to destroy him or whatever. But actually, all he was doing was bringing the violence of segregation into the present, so everybody had to look at it. And suddenly, guess what? White Americans didn't like what they saw. A lot of white Americans didn't like what they saw on the television. Otherwise, things wouldn't have changed, right? And so that's part of the work, is to expose the violence that's under the surface that everybody's hiding, right? Like right now, me and I talk a lot about housing in America. We're in this time of inflation and this time of a bear market economy, but we're also in a time of radical housing loss. There was just that graph that was on NPR of all the places in America where you can't get a house. And it was not just the coastal regions anymore. It's not San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C. It's like the middle.
It's right here.
It's here. Charlotte, it's everywhere. Rural areas, you can't buy a house. There's no inventory. Even if you wanted to buy a house, even if you could buy a house, if you were fortunate enough to have the money to buy a house, you can't get one because there are none. So we know that buying a home and having a home is one of the only and most important and most powerful paths to building wealth and autonomy for anyone in American society. Everybody who has had one and done that knows that. And everyone who lost the ability to do that knows that and understands that. So when you restrict that from people, you're doing violence. Now you might say, well, has anyone intentionally sat back and said, let's take all the houses off the market? No, it's a system, right, of capitalism that we're in right now that is broken. And so until we can fix it, violence is happening all over. Let alone you talk about the homeless folks on the street. I mean, there's so many gradations of housing insecurity right now. Mia posted this great thing, I don't know if you want to talk about it, about the school in San Francisco that built houses for teachers so that they could have teachers because they can't recruit teachers anymore.
They built apartments. One-bedroom apartments, though.
One-bedroom apartments for teachers, $1,400 a month.
Yeah, good luck if you have children.
Right.
I'll be
And
sharing
it was like, it seems like an act of goodness, it's like the right thing for schools to be doing, and maybe it is.
But now your housing is connected to your employment, just like healthcare. So if you lose your job, you lose
Right.
healthcare and you lose housing.
It reminds me of folks who had to live in work camps while they were working on the railroad, and the only place that they could shop was the company store. We are quickly moving back into a time of capitalism where, you work at Amazon and you shop at Amazon and you live in an Amazon house. That's oppression. That's not freedom, right? Especially when you're not getting paid fair wages, you can't unionize, you have no protections. I mean, that's where we're headed, and it seems dark. And I wonder if we're thinking spiritually about what people who come to us, to this, traditionally white, wealthy congregation, where they're coming from, working at Target, Walmart, Amazon, the kind of stress that is on their bodies on a daily basis. I know my brother worked for Amazon for a time. He had to quit. He couldn't do it. It was too painful, We have church members who've worked at Amazon. What they describe to us of what the work and the labor is, it's mind-boggling what they're trying to do to employees there. But that's only job you can have. This is what that movie Nomad was about. People traveling, literally having to go seasonally to work at Amazon distributing factories in big places like Arizona, and then living in a camper because they can't afford a house, traveling then to another state that's having another big Amazon thing, and then getting in their car. This is labor nomads in America. I'm not trying to be bleak here, but I do think we've got to reframe how we think about violence and what it's doing to the souls of our people and to our souls of our nation. And where's the church? What is our job? What is our calling at a time when that kind of violence is being perpetrated everywhere?
Yeah.
What do we do? How do we bring people in? How do we care for people? How do we love people in that time? I think we've got to be very specific about what we believe is hurting them, what we want to do to change it, and how we'll love them. I mean, that's rebuilding community.
Yeah, that's what you do. It's not all social stuff. It's really about listening. What are the needs? What are the needs of our community, right now? Because they have changed even in the past 2.5 years.
Yeah, I'll just admit that I've been in ministry now 20 years, and I've been at this church for 6 years now. I'm insulated, even in my role, knowing everybody in the congregation, from the real challenges of what it feels like to be a worker in America right now. Even I'm insulated from all that. Even when I hear the stories, it's not the same for me. So what I would challenge you all to do, because this has been a massive, dramatic learning experience for me, is try to find somebody that you know who works for one of these huge organizations, an Amazon, a Walmart. It doesn't matter who they are, person of color, etc. Find someone and just do a quick interview. Ask them to go to coffee with you, pay for their coffee, and pay for their lunch. And ask them, tell me what life is like at Walmart. I mean, tell me what life is like at Amazon. Tell me what life is like working at one of these places, and explain it to me so I can feel it, right? So when they tell you about how few bathroom breaks they have, and you can feel that, what it's like to hold it in, when you can feel that, then you'll know. Then you'll be able to empathize. Then you'll be able to understand what's going on in America right now and how people are, I keep wondering, where are people in church? Right? And we know there are a lot of reasons. Church decline, the church has failed a lot of people, we lost people in the pandemic, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You know what no one has talked about yet or written on? Maybe I'm just dumb and I don't know. Has anyone talked about how late-stage capitalism has destroyed the church yet? Where are people on Sunday mornings? They're working.
Or they're sleeping after working all night, yes.
We're not talking about the ways in which the thirst for money and the changes in the way people work in America have destroyed the family and have destroyed the church. Because we were built around leisure time. The whole church idea was built around worshiping when you can rest, taking a day to rest. That's what Sabbath is, finding a time for rest. But when we have destroyed rest, when we have eliminated rest, of course the church is going down the drain. But nobody wants to talk about the connection between capitalism and church decline. It's all like, well, maybe people are tired of Jesus. What? maybe people are tired of worship. You know, no, they're not tired. They're just tired.
Period. You're tired, period.
They're just tired.
Yeah.
They just want to rest. They want to sleep. They want to spend the only time they have with their families. You know?
Right.
I think we've got to reframe, okay, so capitalism has had an impact on church and is causing church decline. What does it mean as a church to give people the thing they're not getting other places? Because we used to give them rest and worship and community. Rest, worship, community, right? That's what Sabbath was. Rest, worship, community. And we're not giving anybody any rest, you know? We're trying to give worship, but they're sleeping at home because they're tired, you know? We're trying to rebuild community. I mean, this is the thing, we got to reframe what church is, what church should be. I think about the nap ministry. I don't know if you want to describe that to them, but there's like this great Instagram ministry, but it's also a real ministry. It's just about napping. It's just naps. It's just sleeping. Come and sleep. And they consider themselves a ministry of the church because rest is revolutionary. It's countercultural. Rest is like the most countercultural thing in American society, right? When the only sin of American society is being lazy or sleeping. That's the only sin. Everything else is up for grabs, right? So what would it mean for the church to decide, you know what, folks are tired. We're going to pull out the pews and we're going to put beds. You know? And the pastor, it doesn't really matter what he says because we're going to sleep anyway. And Lord knows we need to sleep, so we're going to hire a pastor that really kind of has a soft voice, you know?
Like a meditation app.
We're going to bring in some music that makes us feel, maybe we'll put on some white noise, you know?
Yes.
And, you know, just all go to sleep and rest because that's what we need in this culture. And then maybe maybe then out of that rest, like will come an explosion of creativity, which often happens when you rest.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I'm going to go take a nap. So that was a great ending point, Ben.
Okay, let's end there.
This is good. I mean, I want to hear more about this on offline conversation. But if you have questions for Ben beyond this as we wrap up, please send him an email and clog up his email so he can talk about late-stage capitalism and rest.
There's so much.
Thank you all for staying for Talk Back.